Did you know in the state of Maryland that you can own your house, but not own the land that is underneath of it? Yeah, isn't that wild? It's called ground rent. And in today's video, we're gonna be talking all about ground rent, everything you need to know, especially if you are thinking about making a home purchase in the Baltimore metro region. So in the past 2 weeks, I was representing sellers who have properties with ground rent on them. And there came to be a little bit of complication because the first house that was for sale, the buyer was really interested in it, but had hesitancy and second thoughts about buying it because of the fact that it was not a fee simple property, it is a ground rent property. And they just didn't have a good understanding of what ground rent meant. So I thought doing a video to kind of unearth what ground rent is and make sure that people understand it and that it is a very common thing here in the Baltimore metro region would be great content for a video and very educational for everybody who's curious about it. My name is Persia. I'm a local Maryland realtor, and every day I get calls, texts, and emails from people just like you who are thinking about buying or selling in Maryland, and I absolutely love what I do. So whether you're thinking about moving in the next 9 days or 90 days, make sure to reach out to me and to my team. You can call us, text us, email us, we can set up a video call, and it would be our absolute pleasure to help you make the transition of buying or selling in Maryland. So ground rent, as I mentioned at the beginning, is when you own the house itself, but you don't own the land that it sits on. Somebody else owns that land and you pay a rent or a ground rent to the owner of that land. It's a really old and antiquated system, but it is something that's very common in the Baltimore metro region. So it's important for you to know if you're thinking about buying a house. Now, when they established ground rent in Maryland, the reason was to try to make property ownership more affordable for the people who are making home purchases, thinking that if they own the property itself but not the land that's underneath of it, that would make home ownership more accessible for people. And it was an antiquated system that was established a long, long time ago, but something that has persisted and that still exists. Now, how do you know whether or not a property has ground rent on it? Well, when you are looking at a property online or something like that, usually the listing will have information, at least this is listed in the multiple listing service or the MLS, and it will let you know if a property is fee simple, which means that you own both the house and the land, or it will let you know if a property has ground rent, which means that you own the house itself, but that the land underneath of it is owned by someone else. So that should be clearly delineated in the listing itself, fee simple or ground rent. Now, in the event that there is ground rent on the property, that should be disclosed to you as the buyer, and you should know how much that ground rent is. Usually ground rent is a very nominal fee. For example, the listing that I had have in Mount Washington recently had ground rent. It was $150 for the entire year, and it's paid semi-annually. Usually ground rents are paid semi-annually, meaning that you pay twice a year, once perhaps in like November and once maybe in May. So you pay twice a year for that total amount of $150, so $75 twice a year. If you're new to my channel, welcome. Make sure to hit the subscribe button and tap the bell for notifications so that you can be alerted whenever there is new content to the channel. Ground rent usually ranges anywhere from $50 for the year to $150 on the high end. And so again, it should be disclosed to you and very clear to you when you're making a home purchase that there is ground rent on the property, how much it costs, when you're supposed to pay it, and to whom you should pay it. It's very important to know that all ground rents in Maryland must be registered. In Maryland, there is something called a ground rent registry where you can go online and you can check to see if there's ground rent on a property and also to see if that ground rent has been registered to an owner, to a person that you're supposed to pay the money for the ground rent to. If for some reason there is ground rent on the deed, but that rent has never been registered, you don't have to pay it because there's no one to pay it to. In fact, one of the listings that I just mentioned has a ground rent. It is on record and it is on the deed, but it hasn't been registered by whomever owns it. And so that means that we don't know the amount, we don't know who it's paid to. It has to be disclosed to the buyer that it exists, but since it's not registered, they can't come after you for payment. The ground rent registry is handled by the Maryland Department of Taxes and Assessment. So if there's ever a question on who you owe ground rent to or whether you owe it in the first place, you can feel free to check that website to make sure if there's a ground rent, how to pay it, and who to pay it to. Now, if you are buying a house that has a ground rent, but you can't find the person that owns the ground rent, the mortgage company or the lender that you're working with might want to retain some funds just in case the ground rent holder all of a sudden comes out of the woodwork and says, hey, I own this land and you owe me money. What is really good to know is that the most back ground rent that can be collected is 3 years in arrears. So let's say that you've been living in a house for 10 years and all of a sudden someone pops out of the woodwork and says, you should have been paying me this ground rent for that entire time. The most that they can get in back ground rent from you is 3 years worth. So that's really important to know. However, it is a good idea, even though the landlord can only collect 3 years from you, there still can be penalties assessed to you if you're ignoring requests to pay your ground rent. So make sure that if you're getting invoices or that if your ground rent holder is reaching out to you to try to get you to pay that and you're just ignoring it, don't do that, because you could be fined and assessed extra fees that really add up and are going to be way more than just the nominal $50 to $150 that you have to pay yearly. So don't let that pile up on you. Now, what happens if you fail to pay your ground rent? If you fail to pay on time, there will be assessments and penalties for not paying. And in a rare case, the ground rent holder could sue you and try to take the property from you. And again, that's a rare situation, but you don't want to get to that place, especially if the ground rent is like $50 a year or something like that. Just pay it, make sure you know who to pay it to, and get that taken care of so that you're not paying extra fines, fees, and assessments, and possibly having your house taken from you. That's no good. If you fail to pay your ground rent on time and you're facing fines and fees and people are trying to come after you for your land, it's really important that you contact an attorney for advice. It's not really something that you want to deal with on your own. Another important thing to know about ground rent is that you can buy it. You can decide that you want to buy your ground rent or redeem your ground rent. With each invoice of a ground rent assessment from the ground rent holder, they have to provide you with information on how to go about redeeming your ground rent, because it is a right, since you own the house, that you also might want to own the land that's underneath of it. So they have to provide you with information on how to go about doing that and what the costs are associated with buying the land. If you're in the process of purchasing a house and you're working with a title company, then they can arrange for you to redeem your ground rent and to purchase the ground rent as part of your settlement costs. So there's a calculation involved with figuring out how much it is to redeem the ground rent, and then you'll also have to pay like recording fees and taxes and things like that on it. But if you're planning on living in the home for, a good amount of time, it might be a good idea just to go ahead and redeem the ground rent so that you don't have to worry about making those semi-annual payments. And also, it's a good idea because then when you go to sell it, it will be a fee simple property. There won't be ground rent on it, and it'll be a little bit simpler of a process. Some people decide that it's not cost effective for them to redeem the ground rent because let's say it cost $2,000 or $2,500 to redeem a ground rent, but your ground rent is only, $50 twice a year. If you're only planning on living in the property for 5 years, it probably doesn't make sense to put, a big chunk of money like $2,500 on it when over 5 years it might only cost you like $500 to pay your ground rent over that time, right? So you have to do a calculation to see if it makes sense for you. But if it's going to be a long-term property for you, maybe it's going to be your forever home, something like that, it may be worth it to just go ahead and redeem it. I've also had the situation where some people just do not like it psychologically to know that there's someone out there who owns the land underneath of their house. That just is so like cringy to them. They hate it. And so even if it's not a matter of money, it's just a matter of principle and a matter of their own comfort. So even if, you know, it cost very little to pay that person twice a year, they still don't want to do that, and they want to go ahead and redeem it so they own both the house and the land underneath of it. And I totally understand that too. Another important thing to keep in mind is that the Maryland Department of Housing and Community Development has special programs and grants in case you own a house and you want to redeem your ground rent, but you can't afford to do so. So there are programs to work with folks who are in that situation. So even if you're like, I can't afford it, I don't have the $2,000 to redeem it, you can contact different state programs that might help you to make that purchase. Well, there you have it. All there is to know about ground rents in Maryland. They are not that scary. I know when you hear about ground rent, you're like, what the heck is that? And it sounds really old and antiquated, and it is, but it's also common and usually not that big of a deal. So I hope that this information was helpful to you. If you have any questions or if you have any experience with ground rent of your own in Maryland, make sure to let us know and comment. Tell us what your experience was, and we will see you in the next video. Bye.